having crazy spring fever today? I walked across campus and I thought, would they notice if I just didn't show up? I just kept walking. On behalf of the Women's Issues Network and the Women's and Gender Studies program here at Jefferson, welcome to our annual production of Voices. The WIN Committee is responsible and takes it very seriously to honor and celebrate Women's History Month every year, as well as do some advocacy work on campus related to women's and gender studies issues, to human rights issues. And we welcome you here today. This is a staged reading, so you will notice that we will be reading from scripts. It's not a professional production, although we enjoy doing it. If you have questions at the end, we will be more than happy to entertain concepts and ideas about women's history, about voices, about the production, about how we put this together. And having said that, thank you. Having said that, please remember not to continue yelling. Having said that, we hope you enjoy the show. The programs are down front if you need them. Any questions before we get started? In that case, sit back and enjoy the show. Welcome to Voices.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed your tour of the State Capitol building so far. We're now in the West Wing. The exhibit in this hall is the Kentucky Women Remembered exhibit. Each April, the Kentucky Commission on Women receives nominations and selects several women to be honored for their outstanding contributions to the Commonwealth. The exhibit includes portraits painted by Kentucky artists. As you tour the exhibit, I'm sure you'll recognize a few of these women: Loretta Lynn, Rosemary Clooney, and our first woman governor, Martha Lane Collins.
Isn't that Ela Hall's portrait over there? She's from Floyd County. I have relatives in Prestonburg and other places around Floyd County. My grandma talks about how Mrs. Hall opened the Mud Creek Clinic in the 50s. It was the first medical facility in Floyd County. I can't believe in the middle of the 20th century, people in this area didn't have access to a doctor until Hall opened up the clinic. My grandma said that no patient was ever denied care.
She was a remarkable woman, wasn't she? She was featured just a few months ago on the CBS Evening News.
My grandma also knows all about that woman, Verna Mae Sloan. She lived in Knott County. That's the next county over from my grandma's. When she was 65, Verna Mae Sloan wrote her first book about the way that Appalachian people are stereotyped. She wrote the book to help tell their stories and show that the stereotypes are wrong.
Right, she wanted her grandchildren to have a good understanding of their history and culture. Her grandkids liked the book so much that they started passing it around to friends. It wasn't too long after that that the book was sold nationwide.
Both of these women from Appalachia really showed a deep commitment to the region. Wasn't there another woman from a long time ago from somewhere in this area who organized mine workers? I think she was sent to prison.
I believe you're thinking of Mary Harris Jones, better known as Mother Jones. Should we sit?
Well, hello. I'm giving up is what I'm doing. I'm Mary Harris Jones. Most people know me as Mother Jones. I've been labeled as a notorious, troublesome woman, and I think I am. I'm a union troubleshooter, a labor activist, a union organizer, and when I see working conditions that need to be changed, rights that must be granted, and fair wages paid, I take action. So yes, I guess I am a notorious troublesome woman, but I think I'm proud of it. I lived through hard times and have had my mission to make times better for others. I was born in Cork, Ireland, and came to North America when I was just 3 years old. My father believed in Irish independence and became an activist. He was forced, after that, to leave Ireland in 1835. We followed a few years later. I suppose raising hell is in my blood. I grew up in Canada, but moved to the U.S. to teach school in New England and Michigan. I spent some time as a dressmaker and then moved to Tennessee and began teaching again until I got married in 1861. My husband was a coal miner. It was a hard job. It was a hard life. We began a family. But in 1867, my husband and all 4 of our children died from the yellow fever epidemic. I stayed in Memphis to help others who were victims of the yellow fever, but then moved to Chicago, where I once worked as a dressmaker. I opened my own dressmaking business, but faced yet another downfall when my workshop and all of my possessions were burned in the Great Chicago Fire. I had no possessions, I had nowhere to go, but I was given refuge by the Knights of Labor Hall. It was here that my work as a labor activist began. The more I spoke to workers about joining a trade union movement, the more attention I received. I spoke my mind whenever and wherever I felt the need. Starting in 1877, I spent the next 50 years moving from place to place, carrying with me the things I owned, sleeping wherever I could find a spot, in a tent, in a shanty town, anywhere, just anywhere I could place my head for the night. I worked as a union troubleshooter in coal, steel, copper, and garment industries, fighting to improve the wages and better working conditions, and soon I was asked to be the coal miners' representative for the union for mine workers. When miners went on strike, then I organized the women to collect food, supplies, led the wives in marches carrying pots and pans and brooms and mops. I moved from the coal fields and the garment industry in Pennsylvania and Tennessee to the copper fields in Colorado and organized workers there. By 1903, I was back in Pennsylvania protesting the exploitation of child textile workers. Many of them worked 60 hours a week, and I aimed to do something to change that. So I gathered up a group of children and led them on a 100-mile march to President Theodore Roosevelt's home in Long Island. We didn't get past security, but we sure got a lot of publicity. And all of that led to new laws for the child labor in Pennsylvania. When labor disputes arose, Mother Jones was called to the front, always called in to help, to work on behalf of the laborers. In 1911, I was back in the coal mines. The miners in West Virginia were battling the coal companies to renew their work contracts. Things really got ugly, and violence broke out. At the age of 82, I was arrested and sentenced to 20 years in prison, but the sentence was commuted by the governor. Once I was released, I was off to Colorado again, and then back to New York, and finally Chicago to support the dressmakers who worked in conditions that I knew very well. During all my years on the road, advancing the cause of laborers, I wrote for newspapers and journals, and I even wrote my autobiography. Taken as a whole, my activism focused on the class issues. And as I said, I suffered my own tragedies and hardships, as did many miners and laborers. But my goal was to make the world a better place for everybody. My motto, pray for the dead and fight for the living.
Wow, she was a formidable woman.
No doubt about that. She wouldn't be put off, she wouldn't back down, and she wouldn't stand silent. She often said of herself that she was purely and simply a hellraiser.
Well, she definitely was courageous. Going up against the leaders of the coal mining industry and copper mining industry, I can't believe that she led child textile workers on a week-long protest march to New York.
Speaking of textile workers, you might be interested in Clara Lemlich. She was one of the founders of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union.
Let me tell you something about the way we work and what we were paid. There are 2 kinds of work. Regular, that is salary work, and piecework. The regular work pays about $6 a week, and the girls have to be at the machines at 7 o'clock in the morning, and they stay at them until around 8 o'clock at night, with just 1/2 hour for lunch break. Oh, I haven't introduced myself yet. I'm Clara I'm a garment worker, an executive board member of Local 25, and the organizer of the Garment Workers' Strike of 1909. But where was I? Oh, life in the shop, right. Well, the shops are unsanitary, that's the word that's generally used, but there ought to be a worse one used. The bosses in the shop are hardly what you would call educated men. They yell at the girls and they call them down. These were the experiences of so many women of our day, the threads that bound us together. But that's just the way things are, right? Workers can't really do anything about it. Quite the contrary. I did do something about it. In 1909, I delivered a speech against dangerous working conditions and unfair wages, and people listened. In fact, 20,000 women workers listened. And then they went out on strike. Our strike is known as the Uprising of the 20,000. This wasn't my first time speaking up for labor, or women's rights, or community action. I was born and spent my childhood in revolutionary Russia. It was 1903 that I moved with my family to the United States. I was 17 at the time, and like so many other immigrant girls, I found work in a garment shop. I've already mentioned the working conditions and the treatment we faced. It was deplorable, and I knew I had to do something. I began my work as an organizer, encouraging women to join the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. The men of the Garment Workers Union resisted my efforts, but whenever they'd attempt to strike, I would tell them their union would never gain its full force until they included women in their efforts. At one union meeting, I insisted that I be allowed to address the group. I stood before the laborers and said, I am one of those who suffers from the abuses described here, and I knew that we'd go on a general strike. To the surprise of many, over the next few weeks, nearly 40,000 women garment workers walked off their jobs, and it set off a wave of strikes for the next 6 years, from New York to Cleveland to Michigan. While my efforts solidified the women's union and resulted in several factories adopting fair wages and shorter hours, not all union negotiations were successful. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory had not met the standards for safer working conditions, and the consequences were disastrous. In 1911, a fire claimed the lives of 146 workers at the factory who were not able to escape because the doors were locked on the outside and fire escapes were inaccessible. This tragic event, along with the many other unsafe and unfair working conditions, kept me actively promoting workers' rights as well as women's voting rights. I continued in the union until 1954. Due to a technicality, I, an executive board member of the ILGWU, was not granted a pension upon my retirement from the union board, though I finally did receive an honorary stipend. I remained an activist throughout my life. In my later years, I moved into a California nursing home. You probably won't be surprised to learn that while there, yes, I organized the orderlies.
Clara Lumlip took big risks for the cause of women laborers. Given what she'd done throughout her life, I'm not at all surprised she helped unionize the orderlies in her nursing home when she was 94. Talk about commitment.
So many women showed strong character and took great personal risk in the cause of women's rights. Whether it was working conditions or women's suffrage, but their courageous actions led the way for all of us who have followed.
I noticed that you mentioned workers' rights. Do you mean other organizers?
Yes, the one that comes to mind in particular is Dolores Huerta.
I am Dolores Fernandez Huerta. My life's work has been to improve the social and economic conditions of farm workers and their families and to fight discrimination. I was born April 10, 1930 in Dawson, Mexico. My father, Juan Fernandez, was a miner and farm worker. He was a political activist for the union and served in the New Mexico legislature in 1938. But it was my mother, Alicia, whose independence and entrepreneurial spirit inspired me to become a feminist. After my parents divorced, we moved to the farming community of the San Joaquin Valley. This was a diverse area of Mexican, Filipino, African American, Japanese, and Chinese families. My mother ran a small motel where she charged a fair price and paid her workers a fair wage. She was involved in many civic activities and encouraged me to be involved. After graduation from high school, I attended the Delta Community College. I married, had 2 daughters, the first of my 11 children, and settled into a job as an elementary school teacher. But when I saw students coming to school hungry with bare feet, living in such poverty, well, I knew I had to do something. So I helped found the Stockton chapter of the Community Services Organization. We worked to improve the conditions for farmers. In 1960, I founded the Agricultural Workers Association. We set up voter registration drives, created Spanish language voting ballots and driver's tests, and worked to improve conditions in the barrios. I also lobbied politicians to allow migrant workers without U.S. citizenship to receive public assistance. It was during this time, in 1955, that I met Cesar Chavez. He shared a vision of uniting the farm workers. In 1962, we founded the National Farm Workers Association, later to become the United Farm Workers. Cesar and I were a great team, although we had many infamous arguments. I told him, being a new, experienced lobbyist, I am able to speak on a man-to-man basis with other lobbyists. I use my skills in lobbying and negotiating to secure aid for dependent families and disability insurance for farm workers in California in 1963. Then, in 1975, I was instrumental in passing the first law in the U.S. that allowed farm workers the right to organize and bargain for better wages and working conditions. Little did I realize that I had become a role model for women. At first, I thought the women's liberation movement was a middle-class phenomenon. But during the first national boycott of California table grapes that Cesar and I organized, Gloria Steinem and the feminist movement rallied behind us, and I realized that I also needed to fight against gender discrimination within the farm workers movement. In fact, I had always believed that the entire families of farm workers needed to be involved in the movement. After all, women and children were working in the fields alongside of the men. Throughout all of this, nonviolence had been extremely important to me. Despite that, my life and the life of those surrounding me had been in jeopardy on many occasions. 5 of my colleagues were martyred. When I was 58 years old, I was severely beaten by a policeman in San Francisco for protesting against the policies of the presidential candidate, George Bush. During my recovery, I took leave of absence from the union and focused on women's rights. I spent 2 years touring the country, encouraging women and Latinos to run for office. In 1999, I stepped down from the UFW, but I have not given up the fight. I still work through my organization, the Dolores Huerta Foundation, to advocate for working poor women and children. I have had 6 schools named after me and have received many awards, including the Eleanor Roosevelt Human Rights Award and the Ellis Island Medal of Freedom. I've helped elect many of the best politicians of our times, and I have been inducted to the National Women's Hall of Fame. But my work is not done. I may be 83 years old, but I still travel the country to educate students, organizations, and the thousands of working poor their right to a better life and the laws and agencies that can help them.
Huerta, Clara Lumlick, Mother Jones, I'm seeing lot of threads that weave these stories together. These women all faced harsh criticism and took personal risks. I saw a PBS documentary about Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who also stood strong in the face of criticism.
Yes, as did women such as Alice Paul.
Alice Paul?
I was a young child when my mom would take me to the women's suffrage meetings. Women's suffrage, that's women's right to vote. And equal rights has guided my life's work. I was born in New Jersey in 1885. My parents, Quakers and enlightened persons, believed in gender equality, education for women, and social improvement. Unlike many women of my time, I was supported in pursuing higher education. I earned a degree in biology from Swarthmore, conducted graduate work at what is now Columbia University, and earned a Master of Arts degree from the University of Pennsylvania. After studying in England for several years, I returned to the U.S. and then earned a PhD in sociology. By 1928, I had earned three law degrees. My education was a valuable tool in my work for women's suffrage. While studying in England, I met Emmeline Pankhurst, the founder of the British suffrage movement. And already an advocate for women's rights, I joined Pankhurst in radical protests for women's suffrage, including hunger strikes. I returned to the U.S. in 1912 and joined the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And while NAWSA typically focused their campaigns on the state level, I took a different route, lobbying Congress for an actual amendment to the Constitution. In an effort to gain public support, I organized and led a parade through Washington, D.C. in March 1913. We were 8,000 strong, carrying banners and riding floats as we marched down Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House. This happened to be the day before the inauguration of President-elect Woodrow Wilson. And although some of the 500,000 people watching our parade that day were there to harass us, many others were there in support of the cause. The publicity we generated led to a meeting with the president. While he supported the cause, however, he was not ready to support the actual constitutional amendment. But I continued my work, meeting with the president 2 more times, and when that brought no results, we tried a new tactic, picketing. In fact, we suffragists were the first ever to picket the White House in front of the gates, marching with our banners. Beginning in 1917, we were there day and night. As with the parade, we were harassed and physically attacked. And as our protest grew in intensity, the police began arresting us. I was arrested for obstructing traffic and sentenced to 7 months in jail. However, being in jail did not stop the protest. And from there, I actually organized a hunger strike. Even when doctors threatened to send me to an asylum, I refused to eat until they force-fed me. As people learned about our treatment in jail through news reports, we generated more support for our cause. Until finally, the president, who had previously said he supported the cause but wouldn't act on an amendment, publicly supported women's suffrage. Although it took years, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was passed in 1920. Many have commented on my determination to see the cause through to the end. Why did I dedicate my life to women's equality? Because in my mother's words, when you put your hand to the plow, you don't put it down until you finish the road.
She was a woman of great conviction and determination.
And she was just a young woman when she began her work as a women's rights activist.
Many young women today are also advocating for social change. Malala Yousafzai is just 16 years old, and despite Taliban threats and a physical attack against her, she is a leader in the struggle for women's and girls' education in Pakistan.
I'm Malala Yousafzai of Pakistan, and as I speak to you today, my very life is at risk. On October 9th, 2012, not even 3 years ago, I was shot in the head while riding a bus home from school. I was born in Mangora, Pakistan, in the Swat Valley. Mangora was a popular tourist spot, known for its summer festivals. However, as the Taliban made efforts to take control of the area, Mangora was changed, and life for women and girls began to change. I was attending school in the Swat Valley, a school my father had founded. My father's anti-Taliban activism and his support for education for girls brought him to the attention of the Taliban. In 2008, the Taliban began attacks on girls in the Swat in an effort to prohibit their education. Valuing my right and the right of all girls to an education, I made a speech in Peshawar in 2008. Following my speech, I began blogging for the BBC about the Taliban threats of denying an education to girls. For my own safety, I was blogging under the name Golmakai. However, within 3 months, my true identity was revealed. Nevertheless, I continued to speak out publicly about girls and women's rights to an education. In recognition of my work, I received a nomination for the International Children's Peace Prize in 2011. And that same year, I was awarded the Pakistan National Youth Peace Prize. With all this national and international support I was receiving, the Taliban issued death threats against me. At first, my family did not think the Taliban would actually attack a child. However, as I've already mentioned, that was not the case. In October 2012, on my way home from school, a gunman boarded the bus I was riding and asked which of us was Malala Yousafzai. When my friends glanced in my direction, the gunman immediately responded, shooting me in the left side of my head. 2 other girls were also injured in the attack. I was immediately flown to a military hospital where a portion of my skull was removed. I was then transferred to a hospital in Birmingham, England, where I underwent numerous surgeries. By March of 2013, I had recovered enough to begin attending school in Birmingham. In July 2013, on my 16th birthday, I gave a speech at the United Nations, emphasizing that education is a right to which all are entitled. Despite continued threats against the Taliban, I continue to advocate for education of girls and women. I have published an autobiography about my experience, and I received the Sakharov Prize for freedom of thought. This past October, I was awarded the 2014 Nobel Peace Prize.
She's so young, near my age, and she still speaks out for women's and children's rights even after being shot by the Taliban.
Yes, to say that she is a young woman of strong character and fortitude would certainly be an understatement, but she is that and much more. Historically, women have been passionate in their advocacy for education. Mary McLeod Bethune, who is an educator and an activist, is a strong example of this passionate commitment.
It is our pledge to make a lasting contribution to all that is finest and best in America, to cherish and enrich her heritage of freedom and progress by working for the integration of all her people, regardless of race, creed, or national origin, into her spiritual, social, cultural, civic, and economic life, and thus aid her to achieve the glorious destiny of a true and unfettered democracy. This is the pledge taken by members of the NCNW, the National Council of Negro Women. I founded this organization in 1935 to give Black women the opportunity to realize their goals for social justice and human rights through united, constructive action, both in the U.S. and around the world. As a teacher, I was inspired to open a school for girls. So in 1904, I opened the Daytona Educational and Industrial Training School for Negro girls. Although the school opened with only 5 students, it grew to include high school and a nursing school. In 1929, we merged with Cookman Institute and became a co-educational college, Bethune-Cookman College. Education was a driving force in my life, and through my efforts to provide education and opportunity to Black girls and to Black women, I was led to the political arena. In fact, I assisted 4 U.S. presidents, serving as an influential leader in the Black cabinet, which organized the Federal Council of Negro Affairs, and serving as Director of Negro Affairs for the National Youth Council. I constantly worked to help young people find jobs. In honor of my service and contribution to the advancement of Black women and youth, in 1974, I became the first Black leader and the first woman to have a monument erected on public land in Washington, D.C. The National Park Service also made my home, which was also the headquarters of the NCNW, a memorial site in 1994. This college I founded has grown, now offering bachelor's degrees in 26 majors, and the NCNW and its affiliates continue to be a powerful organization, now connecting more than 4 million women within the organization.
Bethune's commitment to education and civil rights is inspiring.
Yes, her pledge is a strong testament to the character of Bethune, and it speaks to the importance of rights for all people.
Right, sort of like Aung San Suu Kyi.
Suu Kyi? Why does that sound familiar?
The Burmese, well, it's called Myanmar now, political activist. She spent 15 years under house arrest for her leadership of the National League for Democracy in Burma and won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1991.
I am Aung San Suu Kyi, and from my earliest years, Burmese independence and democracy have been part of my life. I was 2 years old when my father negotiated Burma's independence. He was assassinated that same year. I've lived and been educated in Rangoon, Burma, which is now known as Yangon, Myanmar, as well as India and England. I then moved to New York City and worked at the United Nations while pursuing further education. However, in 1988, my mother became ill, so I returned to Burma to care for her. While there, I became involved in Burmese politics and became the leader of the pro-democracy movement. In that same year, 1988, political changes led to mass demonstrations for democracy. Government efforts to suppress the demonstrators turned violent. These demonstrations occurred on August 8, 1988, and have become known as the 8/8/88 Uprising. Following the 8/8/88 Uprising, I led the pro-democracy movement to form the National League for Democracy and led a rally at the Capitol calling for democratic government. However, I was not permitted to run for office. I had been placed under house arrest by the military government prior to the elections and again following the elections. Over a period of 21 years, I spent 15 of them under house arrest, finally released in November of 2010. In recognition of my ongoing support of human rights and my political party's commitment to nonviolent action, I have received a number of awards from the international community: the Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought in 1990, the Nobel Peace Prize in 1991, the Nehru Award for International Understanding, and the International Simon Bolivar Prize. My political party, the NLD, supports my candidacy for the presidency of Myanmar in 2015, but a clause written into the Constitution bars my candidacy. Because my sons hold British passports, and I was once married to a British academic, I'm currently prevented from running. However, many feel this clause was written specifically to prevent me from running. So members of the NLD party are protesting this clause and calling for a revision before the election this coming October.
Like Suu Kyi, Wilma Mankiller was another woman who rose to a leadership role. Actually, the leadership role of her people. It all started when she became an advocate for the rights of Native Americans, joining an occupation of Alcatraz Island in the name of Indians of all tribes.
Seriously? Sort of like Occupy Wall Street?
Yeah, something along those lines. Wilma Mankiller went on to become the first female chief of the Cherokee Nation.
Wait, seriously, her name is Mankiller?
So what's in a name? Is my name an asset or a hindrance? Well, in my mid-20s, as a homemaker and a mother, I was known in social circles as Mrs. Hugo Alaya. After my experiences in the late 60s and 70s with the Native American self-determination movement and the feminist movement, I ceased to be Mrs. Hugo Alaya, and I reconnected with my ancestral heritage. I'd spent my early years on my father's ancestral lands in Oklahoma. We were dirt poor and we often hunted squirrel and other small game for dinner. We had no electricity and we lit our home with coal oil. My family relocated to California as part of the Bureau of Indian Affairs program intended to move American Indians to industrial jobs in the cities, a program which also threatened to weaken reservation ties and lessen the political clout of American Indian tribes. I certainly didn't have an easy transition from Oklahoma to San Francisco, But I made some friends and they taught me the basics, like how to use a telephone or how to roller skate. My father, Charlie Mankiller, instilled in my family a pride in our heritage, and so I spent many of my afternoons in the San Francisco Indian Center. Because there were no plans for me to go to college, I hadn't particularly cared about academics, I found a pink-collar job, and then I soon met an Ecuadorian college student. We married, and I settled down to raise 2 children and live a middle-class life. I wasn't involved in politics or social issues until the Native American occupation of Alcatraz Island. I didn't join the first wave of protesters, or even the second wave. When I finally did join the protest, which lasted 19 months, the issues facing American Indians flashed like bright comets, reigniting my connection with my ancestry. At the same time, I was growing increasingly aware that myself had been defined as being a housewife. My husband and his family, they didn't appreciate it very much. My husband said, "You can't buy a car." I did so anyways. I used that car and I traveled to tribal meetings all over the place. I learned more about my heritage and I began taking college courses in social work and became educated about my role in society. In 1974, my husband and I divorced. In 1976, I took $20, the only $20 I had in my pocket, and my 2 children, and I moved back to Oklahoma. I ceased to be Mrs. Hugo Alaya, and I remembered that I was Wilma Mankiller. Mankiller is the village protector of the Cherokee people. You can say I became just that, the village protector. I found my work as a community coordinator at the Cherokee Tribal Headquarters. I completed a degree at the University of Arkansas, and I worked on organizing and grant writing for the Cherokee people. During my leadership, which was recognized for my management skills, I was asked by Cherokee Chief Ross Swimmer in 1983 to run as his deputy in the next tribal election. After some hesitation, I agreed. I was promptly criticized, not for my politics or not for my abilities, but because of my gender. We won the election despite those objections. I worked with Swimmer to lead the Cherokee people and the Cherokee tribe forward. And in 1985, Swimmer was appointed by President Ronald Reagan to be the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. That made me the first female chief of the Cherokee Nation. My fellow Cherokees had never been led by a woman, so I toughened myself for that challenge. As chief, I oversaw a historic self-determination agreement. Through this, the Cherokee Nation was one of 6 tribes to assume responsibility of all Bureau of Indian Affairs funds formerly spent by them. I oversaw an annual budget of $75 million, and I raised $20 million more for education. I worked to support a Cherokee health clinic, now named in my honor. In 1995, I was diagnosed with an illness, so I decided not to seek another term. But my work has left a lasting impression on the Cherokee Nation, as well as the political policies and social practices in the United States. I've received recognition for that work, being named 1987's Woman of the Year and receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1988, one of the 2 highest civilian honors in the United States. And I believe that for the Cherokee Nation, I have lived up to my name, Mankiller. I am a village protector.
So Wilma Mankiller was the first female chief? That's amazing.
Some years before, another woman was breaking down the barriers of gender and race. Shirley Chisholm was the first African-American woman to be elected to the U.S. Congress, as well as the first African-American to seek the presidential nomination of a major political party.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Shirley Chisholm. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. I also spent time living with my grandmother in Barbados. While living in Barbados, I attended their traditional British-style schools. I also made the best grades and was an excellent student. I later went to Brooklyn College in New York. Soon after my graduation in 1946, I began working in early childhood education. I advanced to the role of consultant for the New York Bureau of Child Welfare. While working, I pursued my graduate degree at Columbia University and was involved in local politics. My dedication for education opportunities and social justice led me to run as well as be elected to the New York City Assembly in 1964. And in 1968, I ran again in the U.S. Congress. Ladies and gentlemen, the Fighting Shirley Chisholm, broadcasting louder for my soundtrack as I campaigned throughout Brooklyn. I was determined not to become a part of the system. I had made sure that my motto, unbought and unbossed, was clearly heard and understood. I won that election in 1968, and in 1969, I made history again by becoming the first African-American Congresswoman. One of my first committee assignments was to be over the House of Forestry Committee. But my goal and objective was to be an advocate for education and civil rights. Don't forget, I'm fighting Shirley Chisholm. So I demanded to be reassigned and placed on the Veterans Affairs Committee and later on the Education and Labor Committee. In 1969, I also was one of the founding members of the Congressional Black Caucus. I served 7 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives. And during this time, I made another historical first. In 1972, I became the first African-American majority party candidate to make a bid for the presidency of the United States of America. I ran for the Democratic nomination against George McGovern. Someone once asked me about my bid for the Democratic nomination, and I said to them that the next time a woman runs, or a black, or a Jew, or any other group that this country is not ready for, I believe that he or she will they will be taken very seriously from the start. I'm sure you want to ask me, why did I run for the highest office of the land? I could only reply and say to you, somebody had to do it first. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
After she finished her 7th term, she went back to teaching. She's left a legacy in both areas.
I thought when I came for a tour of the Capitol, I learned about government and history, and maybe a little bit about architecture. I never realized I'd leave knowing so much about the courageous and committed women who contributed so much to our society. It really shows how our lives are woven together by similar threads.
And we'll be honoring several more women in just a few weeks. I'll bet that you know quite a few women that are examples of character, courage, and commitment.
Yeah, I could start my own Women Remembered exhibit. Now that I'm thinking about it, I'll have to clear a lot of space on my walls.
I would like to ask you all to stand and take a quick bow. Thank you for being part of Voices this year. weren't familiar with before you came today? Couple? Yeah. Okay. Who was new for you? We're always curious because when we do this every year, we're trying to figure out how to include voices that students may or may not have heard of. This is good research for us. Dolores Huerta. Mother Jones.
Wilma Man Killer.
Alice Paul and Wilma Man Killer. Yeah. Great. On behalf of the WIN committee, thank you. Go celebrate the